Good morning, beautiful people. I hope you're having a fantastic day. My name is David and I want to talk about reading today. When it comes to reading in your second language, it's sometimes a little bit dreadful. It becomes really slow because you don't know all the vocabulary. Sometimes there's grammar that you don't know if you understand anything at all. And so in today's video, what I really want to focus on is breaking down the process of how to practice reading, how to get better at reading consistently, be that with or without a teacher, and also share a couple of techniques, a couple of tricks that I'm applying to my own learning, that I'm applying to my students' learning, and that I've just kind of found on the internet. Oh my god, this is horrible right here. Ugh. That's a lot better. So, first of all, I want to talk about the different types of reading that you're most likely to encounter. Usually when we talk about reading in the context of second language learning, we talk about three types of reading. The first one is skimming. Skimming is just reading for gist, and the idea is that you go through a text very, very quickly, just trying to get the general idea. The next type of reading is scanning. So the idea of scanning is that you're looking for specific keywords or really small phrases in the text in order to answer specific questions that you have. And then the third type of reading is intensive reading, or what we often also call close reading. So this is your typical, you're sitting down and you really read in detail. You're trying to understand 100% of what's going on in the text, and you want to be able to almost repeat the ideas that the author is presenting to you. So the way that you're going to practice reading really depends on what your particular learning situation is. So somebody who is learning with a teacher is going to fundamentally learn differently from somebody who is learning with a teacher. So let's talk about how you practice reading with a teacher. This is pretty straightforward because in the end you have two ways of reading. Either you're reading in class with your teacher. When it comes to reading as homework, so sort of like reading outside of the classroom, you want to see it as a way of preparing for class, right? This is your opportunity to really make the most out of the money that you're paying your teacher. Try to find all the passages that are a little bit unclear to you, right? So like where the grammar is a little bit weird, where you don't quite understand the sentence despite having looked up the vocabulary. And then when you get into class, when you're talking to your teacher again, you have the chance to ask them what that stuff means. The last thing that a teacher can do for you is simply give you recommendations of what to read outside of class, right? Or what kind of fiction to read, what kind of non-fiction to read, maybe some websites or newspapers that they think is appropriate to whatever your language needs are. So fundamentally different from that is learning without a teacher, and I think this is becoming more and more a reality for people, or learning with multiple teachers, so you don't have that regular check-in with only one person who observes your learning process, but you're the one in charge of your own learning process and you're kind of just using teachers here and there as an additional resource. But basically you're structuring your own learning. Obviously the same three types of readings apply here as well. However, you have to think of techniques to overcome that lack of feedback from a professional. So the first thing that you can do is obviously look up all the vocabulary. One way to do it is to scan for all the vocabulary that you don't know, write it down, find a translation for it, and then read the text. The second way to do it is to read the text and just underline all the vocabulary that you don't know and try to understand as much as possible without looking up the vocabulary. And then after reading, you're going to look up the translations or the definitions of the vocabulary that you marked or that you wrote down and try to confirm whether you've got the idea in the text or whether you didn't. A big thing for reading is obviously accumulating more and more vocabulary, and I think one of the best ways to do that is with any kind of vocabulary diary. You could do the same thing with flashcards, be that physical flashcards or flashcards apps. Then there are some translation techniques that you want to apply, and the biggest problem with translating text text is actually not the vocabulary, it's getting the grammar right. Here's what you can do. Try to translate the portion of the text that is ambiguous to you, where you don't understand the grammar. Write down all the possible interpretations that you can think of. You want to check that against all the other information in the text. If there's only one sentence that's ambiguous to you, well, great. However, if you have several translations that are ambiguous to you, several sentences that you're not quite sure about, it's going to be a little bit of guesswork. If you have the chance to talk to native speakers or even check in with the teacher, you should absolutely use them. Next, I want to talk about something that is a little bit difficult for a lot of people, which is speed reading. And this is kind of a controversial topic because oftentimes we think about reading quickly in terms of sacrificing information retention. What I mean by information retention is as you read a text, you might forget some things that are mentioned in the text, right? So your goal when you're practicing speed reading is to keep your information retention as high as possible. So let's talk about 3 techniques to improve the speed of your reading. The first one is again pretty much straightforward. That's what everyone will recommend to you. It's time yourself. But here's the problem with that technique. It doesn't really help you directly develop habits, develop skills that help you read faster. It just puts more stress on you and pushes you to get a little bit outside of your comfort zone. I came across 2 really interesting techniques that should help you actually read faster. The first one is called grouping. Grouping is the idea of forcing your brain to look at 2 words at the same time. So as you're going through a text in your inner monologue, you're not going word by word, but you're going 2 words at a time. And how can you force yourself? Well, simply by forcing yourself to always read, to always look at 2 words at once, right? This is something that you have to first practice in isolation. Do it with a text that you're already familiar with. So, if you don't have to focus on the meaning of a text, you can focus on a technique like grouping. The second technique that I came across is called pacing. So the idea of pacing is that you just want to reduce the time span between jumping from one group of 2 or 3 words to the next group of 2 or 3 words. Once you're comfortable with grouping and you have a text where you don't have to focus on the content of the text anymore, you can force yourself to jump from one group to the next one a little bit faster. And again, this is where a stopwatch or a timer becomes really useful because you can use that to pressure yourself a little bit into jumping quicker, into pacing a little bit faster. Okay, next up, let's quickly talk about some organizational tips. But you have limited time. How do you practice more effectively? Well, the first idea is schedule specific times to practice each individual language skill. Set up 2 hours a week that you only practice reading. And then you can go through the stuff that I mentioned earlier and focus on one of these things within this hour. The next idea is to set up clear learning goals. How much you want to achieve within that allotted time. So let's say your goal is to read 4 news articles every single week and you have 2 hours scheduled for yourself for reading. That means your goal is going to be 2 news articles every single week. However, be careful with this kind of stuff, right? These sort of goals should be flexible. For one lesson, you feel like you're only able to get through 1 article, and that is your achievement. It's more important to sit down and practice than the actual amount of practice that you have achieved in the end. And the last organizational tip that I wanted to share here is identify your weaknesses. If you feel like your biggest problem is grammar comprehension, try to spend a little bit additional time on grammar practice. This is probably one of the most difficult things, and I believe working with a teacher is going to be so much more efficient. But if you're really on your own, look for resources that let you go through advanced grammar. Last but not least, I wanted to talk a little bit about what to read. A lot of teachers always recommend their students to just read the news regularly. However, if you are at the beginning of intermediate, or even if you're a beginner in the language, that's not gonna help you. You want to find material that is really around your level and maybe a little bit challenging in order to effectively improve your reading skill. If you want to read the news in the language that you're learning, a lot of websites or a lot of governments have resources for that. I know that the NHK has news for Japanese learners particularly, but I also know that there are resources for that in English, and I'm going to link to some of those in the description below. If you're not into news, if you're more into fiction and reading novels, look for graded readers. So graded readers are commonly told stories, so things like fairy tales, or sometimes people even write stories for language learners. I've also linked to a blog post that lists a couple of English graded readers for different levels. And again, lastly, ask other people for recommendations. There are definitely other people who are learning the particular language that you're trying to learn. Ask your teachers, ask your friends, ask anyone who you feel might have a good idea. Let's recap. When you practice reading, you want to focus on 3 types of reading. You want to focus on skimming, scanning, and intensive reading. If you don't have a teacher as a resource to use to aid you, you want to make sure that you always confirm your understanding of the text, mainly by looking up the words that you don't know and translating the sentences that are ambiguous to you. For the words that you don't know, keep a vocabulary diary or regularly add to a deck of flashcards. Next up, develop speed reading techniques, but as you practice becoming faster, always make sure that you get faster at the same level of information that sticks in your head. Find material that is on your level to read. If you're interested in current events, look for news for language learners. Look for graded readers, get recommendations from friends, other language learners, teachers. And lastly, don't take a lot of these concepts at once. You start at a lower level and you work yourself up there. Hi! If you've made it this far into the video, thank you so much for watching. It really takes me a lot of time to edit these right now, but I definitely do want to do more. So I'm currently planning on doing more videos like this on the other 3 skills. So talking about writing, listening, and also speaking in the future. And I'm also working on some other videos that are more covering the sort of science of language learning. So I have one video planned right now that talks about formality, kind of why we use formality and how we can use it more intuitively in English. And I'm also working on another video that talks more about the research of how we learn languages, particularly second languages. If this is stuff that you are interested in, or if there are other recommendations, things that you want to see me talk about or research, please do consider leaving a comment below this video. It would really help me out, and it shows me that there are some people interested in this kind of content. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I see you in the next.